Good afternoon. My name is Michael Lucchese. I am a senior majoring in American Studies and minoring in journalism. Today, I'm introducing Roger Kimball, who is the editor and publisher of the New Criterion and the publisher of Encounter Books, a contributor to numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Sunday Telegraph, and the American Spectator. Mr. Kimball blogs at Roger's Rules on pjmedia.com. He is editor, co-editor, or author of a number of books, including Athwart History, Half a Century of Polemics, Animadversions, and Illuminations, William F. Buckley Jr. Omnibus, The Long March, How the Cultural Revolutions of the 1960s Changed America, The Fortunes of Permanence, Culture and Anarchy in an Age of Amnesia, and the forthcoming Vox Populi, The Perils and Promises of Populism. Please join me in welcoming Roger Kimball.
Thank you, Michael. Well, it's great to be here at Hillsdale. I've had a very nice time. I brought my son along. He's gone now, but he's considering coming here. So, Leszek Kolakowski. So I've done a informal and decidedly unscientific poll in my last few days, padding about the campus. And I suspect that Leszek Kolakowski is not a household name, which makes me all the more delighted to be able to pay homage to my late friend and teacher. Kolakowski was undoubtedly the greatest Polish philosopher of the last century. So what, you might say? As Kierkegaard once said when somebody called him the greatest Danish philosopher of his age, he said, "I'm the only Danish philosopher." But Kolakowski was much more than an academic. He was an apostle of freedom, a model of scholarly erudition, and what's most pertinent for our discussion this week is that he was one of the most articulate and effective scourges of that perhaps most murderous ideology that the mind of man has yet contrived. I, of course, mean Marxism, Soviet Marxism. In the debate over Marxism in the 20th century, I have no hesitation in saying that Kolakowski won hands down. Alas, as he knew all too well, in the affairs of mankind, winning debates, indeed, rational argument of any kind, generally plays but an insignificant role, at least in the short term. Kolakowski was just a few months shy of his 82nd birthday when he died in July of 2009 at his home in Oxford. For anyone inclined to despair that we live in an intellectually diminished age, Kolakowski provided a glittering counterexample. He was an intellectual giant. What is even more extraordinary, he was an intellectual giant whose accomplishments were widely celebrated. Kolakowski died full of honors as well as years. He snapped up the coveted, if often risible, MacArthur Prize, ditto the Klug Prize for lifetime achievement in the humanities. He walked away with a cool $1 million for that bijou. Then there were the innumerable degrees honoris causa and lesser awards, honors, lectureships, and sundry recognition. He received and deserved them all. Born in Radom in eastern Poland in 1927, Kolakowski was a boy of 12 when the Nazis stormed into Poland. I remember the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, he writes in an essay called Genocide and Ideology, which I saw from the outside. I lived among Poles who were active in helping Jews and who risked their lives every day trying to save those few they could from the inferno. In 1945, the war over, he joined the Communist Party. The Communists, he had been told, were anti-fascists. And at first, he believed it. He studied and then taught philosophy in Warsaw, where he also edited a scholarly journal. But when it came to communism, Kolakowski found to his sorrow that maturity begot doubts. Doubts brought forth criticism, and criticism, he discovered, was a dangerous commodity in Soviet-controlled Poland. In 1954, Kolakowski was accused of straying from the Marxist-Leninist ideology, a charge, I have to admit, was eminently true. He was straying from the Marxist-Leninist ideology. In 1966, after delivering a speech commemorating the 10th anniversary of the October thaw, he was expelled from the party with all the usual ceremony. The state-controlled press launched a series of attacks on the renegade. He was removed from his university chair for, quote, forming the views of the youth in a manner contrary to the official tendency of the country. In 1968, he went into exile. His works were promptly enrolled in the Index of Forbidden Authors and until 1981 could be neither referred to nor cited officially. After leaving Poland, Kolakowski embarked on a career in the West. He made stops at Berkeley, which gave him an opportunity to learn firsthand about and therefore to despise the mind-numbing New Left culture of the 1960s and 1970s. At Yale, where I met and studied with him, and then at the University of Chicago and Oxford, his intellectual homes for the last decades of his life. Throughout the 1980s, he aided and abetted the Solidarity movement, which was instrumental in ridding Poland of its communist oppressors. It would be an injustice, however, if this impressive scholarly inventory were to obscure one of Kolakowski's most conspicuous gifts. I mean his sense of humor. This is a conference about Soviet communism, so I won't dilate on this aspect of Kolakowski's work. I would be remiss, however, if I left out that aspect of his work altogether. So I'll leave you with a single tantalizing tidbit. The title of an essay, to wit, quote, a comment on Heidegger's comment, on Nietzsche's alleged comment, on Hegel's comment, on the power of negativity. Now, this orotund pseudo-scholarly rubric neatly ushers Kolakowski into a serious point. In a famous interview with Der Spiegel, published in 1976, shortly after his death, Heidegger was at pains to exonerate himself from his association with the Nazis. Among other things, he suggested that anyone who had ears to hear would know that he had criticized the Nazi regime in the lectures he delivered on Nietzsche and the will to power after Hitler rose to power. It probably takes an ear subtler than mine, Kolakowski notes, to hear this criticism. Indeed, Kolakowski shows that Heidegger obliquely but clearly expressed his commitment to the German imperialist regime in those lectures. Kolakowski is, of course, best known as an explicator and critic of Marxism and its spiritual allotropes. Hence his place at this conference. His magnum opus, Main Currents of Marxism, is a 3-volume work of philosophical demolition. Sidney Hook aptly called the book magisterial, and so it is. It is typical that Kolakowski, endeavoring to explain the origin of dialectic, starts not with Rousseau or Hegel, as most commentators on Marx do, but with Plotinus, who flourished around 240 AD. The middle volume of Main Currents offers a detailed anatomy of Marxist thought, and the work concludes with a survey of 20th century varieties, from the Marxism in action of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and Mao, to the bloviating theoretical Marxism of Lukács, Sartre, and the so-called Frankfurt School. At present, Kolakowski observed in Main Currents, alluding to Marx's famous adage, Marxism neither interprets the world nor changes it. It is merely a repertoire of slogans serving to organize various interests. Main Currents demonstrates how Marxism, committed in Kolakowski's words to the self-deification of mankind, became the greatest fantasy of our century. It was an idea, he wrote, that began in Promethean humanism and culminated in the monstrous tyranny of Stalinism. As such, Marxism provides a permanently valuable admonition about the dangers of utopian schemes, what Kolakowski called, in the concluding sentence of Main Currents, the farcical aspect of human bondage. There were, as Kolakowski recognized, many aspects to that farce, as is shown by his observation that one should be as careful about believing in a green utopia as in a red one. I hope that some charitably minded person will send a copy of Main Currents to Al Gore. He would discover any number of inconvenient truths between its covers. A corollary of Kolakowski's criticism of Marxism was his appreciation for the virtues of capitalism as an indispensable enabler of freedom. Although I should say here that I reluctantly use the word capitalism. I would prefer the free market because capitalism, that word, although not coined by Marx, was popularized by Marx and other Marxists, and it meant for them essentially exploitation. So I always use the word with a slight reluctance, but it's gained such wide currency that one can't avoid it entirely. So the free market, Kolakowski noted in 1995, developed spontaneously and organically from the spread of commerce. Nobody planned it, and it did not need an all-embracing ideology, whereas socialism, on the contrary, was an ideological construction. Ultimately, capitalism is human nature at work. That is, man's greed is allowed to follow its course, whereas socialism is an attempt to institutionalize and enforce fraternity. What a terrible idea that would be. It seems obvious by now, Kolakowski continued, that a society in which greed is the main motivation of human action, for all of its repugnant and deplorable aspects, is incomparably better than a society based on compulsory brotherhood, whether in national or international socialism. Those are very wise words. It is important to note that Main Currents of Marxism is not of historical interest only. Notwithstanding the collapse of the Soviet Union, Marxism remains eminently worth studying, not least because its aspirations continue to percolate in the dreams of various utopian planners, not to mention various self-absorbed anti-capitalist beneficiaries of capitalism. You needn't go to China or Cuba or Venezuela to understand this. Just look at the increasingly pink and authoritarian complexion of the European Union, the repellent theories of Jeremy Corbyn, or indeed the stultifying Marxist-inspired intolerance that is disfiguring so many Western universities today. In 2005, Kolakowski published a collection of essays modestly titled, "My Correct Views on Everything." In the introduction, he notes that communism was not the crazy fantasy of a few fanatics, nor was it the result of human stupidity and baseness. It was a very real part of the history of the 20th century, and we cannot understand this history of ours without understanding communism. We cannot get rid of this specter by saying it was just human stupidity or human corruptibility. The specter is stronger than the spells we cast on it. It might come back. A couple of years before Kolakowski's death, Oxford University Press published a new omnibus edition of Main Currents of Marxism, all 3 volumes in one. The only addition was a brief new preface by the author. Although only a few pages long, the preface is very much worth reading. It reminds us straight away, and this emerges as a theme of the book, that Marxist doctrine, by calling for the abolition of private property and the more or less total subordination of the market to state control, provided a good blueprint for converting human society into a giant concentration camp. The abolition of the market, he wrote elsewhere, means a gulag society. Kolakowski's new preface also contains an arresting aside about the book's publication history. Written in Polish between 1968 and 1976, when their publication in Poland, he said, could only be dreamed of, the 3 volumes of Main Currents were first printed in Paris and circulated underground in Poland. They were not published legally in Poland until 2000. In the intervening years, the book has been translated into many languages, including Chinese. The last time I checked, however, only the first 2 volumes, which take the story of Marxism through the death of Lenin, had been published in France. The 3rd volume, which deals with Stalinism and its offshoots, including sainted New Left thinkers like Louis Althusser and Sartre, is still waiting for a French translation. Why? Perhaps, Kolakowski speculates, because its publication would provoke such an outrage among French leftists that the publishers were afraid to risk it. The Australian philosopher David Stove once observed that, as an item on the intellectual agenda, Marxism is scarcely even a joke. Marxism is a fearsome social and police problem, but so is the drug trade. It is a fearsome political problem, but so is Islamic fundamentalism. But an intellectual problem, he said, Marxism is not, any more than the drug trade or Islamic fundamentalism. So how interesting that Kolakowski should have devoted 1,500 pages of Main Currents of Marxism, as well as dozens of essays, to its genesis, its permutations, its horrifying record of mass murder. In a 1995 essay called What is Left of Socialism, he apostrophizes Karl Marx as a powerful mind, a very learned man, and a good German writer. I feel constrained to add that if Marx can be said to be a good writer, it is in the highly qualified sense that the curate in the famous story said that his breakfast egg was good, but only good in parts. The Communist Manifesto, the theses on Feuerbach, the German ideology contain some powerful writing. But have you looked into Das Kapital or the Grundrisse lately? Like most of Marx's writing, they should carry a Surgeon General's warning against attempting to operate heavy machinery after reading. Yet in the end, I suspect that Kolakowski would have agreed with David Stove. He did not endorse Marxism as an intellectual phenomenon. Rather, he took it seriously as a product of human spiritual striving, perverted striving, perhaps, but nevertheless heartfelt and deeply, perhaps inextricably ingrained in the human character. That's why we have to take it seriously. This involved him in a complicated historical itinerary. Looking for the origin of dialectic, Kolakowski took readers back not only to the soteriology of Plotinus, as I've mentioned, but also to the entire library of classical and Christian thinkers. He provided a lofty vantage point from which to regard the sage who assured his audience in the endlessly quoted snippet from the Theses on Feuerbach that hitherto philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Meister Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa loom as large in Kolakowski's exposition of Marx as do the proletariat, the labor theory of value, and the contradictions of capitalism. He does not give Marxism the benefit of the doubt exactly, but he does give it the benefit of patient scrutiny and the highest level of historical intelligence and philosophical acumen. The results of that scrutiny are devastating. Perhaps the most grotesque aspect of Marxism's intellectual pretension is its claim to scientific rigor. In one typical effusion, Engels insisted that the social laws Marxism claimed to have laid bare were no less objective than geological deposits. Part of what it means to be a science is to be able to make verifiable predictions about the behavior of the phenomena one is studying. But Marxism has proven to be completely barren as an instrument of social understanding or prediction. This does not mean, as Kolakowski points out, that Marxist theories have not been useful. It's just that their usefulness has been confined entirely to providing a set of slogans that were supposed to justify and glorify communism and the slavery that inevitably goes with it. The truth is that all of Marx's major predictions have turned out to be wrong. He said that societies based on a market economy would suffer spiraling class polarization and the disappearance of the middle class. Yet every society lucky enough to enjoy the fruits of a market economy shows that Marx was wrong about that. Marx predicted the growing immiseration and impoverishment of the working class in capitalist societies. Actually, he didn't merely predict that it would happen, he predicted with Hegelian owlishness that it would happen necessarily and inevitably. But the opposite has happened. Indeed, as Kolakowski notes, in the second edition of Capital, Marx updated various statistics and figures, but not those relating to workers' wages. Those figures, if updated, would have contradicted his theory. Now, Kolakowski touches here on an aspect of Marx's work that I think has not received sufficient attention. I mean its casual but shocking mendacity. When the facts didn't fit his theory, Marx simply disregarded them. This helps to account for the curious fact that refutation and contradiction, things that might convince a dispassionate observer to change his mind, leave the true believing Marxist entirely unruffled. Whatever else one can say about it, Marxism is surely one of the most impervious systems of thought ever devised. It is also one of the most protean. It has always, as Kolakowski notes, been able to change content from one situation to another and crossbreed with other ideological traditions. In part, this is a testimony to its intellectual adaptability, but it is also, as I just noted, a testimony to its mendacity. Thus, we find Marx writing to Friedrich Engels in 1857 about an election prediction that he had made. "It's possible that I shall make an ass of myself," Marx acknowledged. "But in that case, one can always get out of it with a little dialectic. I have, of course, so worded my proposition as to be right in either way." Nice work if you can get it. And Marx and his heirs got a lot of that work. Marx predicted the inevitable revolution of the proletariat. Mark that, the inevitable revolution of the proletariat. That's the very motor of Marxism. Take away the proletarian revolution and you neuter the theory. But there have been no proletarian revolutions, ever. The Bolshevik Revolution, as Kolakowski points out, had nothing to do with Marxian prophecies. Its driving force was not a conflict between the industrial working class and capital, but rather was carried out under slogans that had no socialist, let alone Marxist content. The slogans in force then were peace and land for peasants. Marx said that in a capitalist economy, untrammeled competition would inevitably squeeze profit margins. Eventually and very soon, the economy would grind to a halt and capitalism would collapse. Well, take a look at the capitalist economies in the 150 years since Marx wrote. Have profit margins evaporated? Marx thought that when they matured, capitalist economies would hamper technical progress and communist societies would support it. Obviously, the opposite is true. No, Marxism has been as wrong as it is possible to be wrong for a theory. Addicted to the self-deification of mankind, it continually bears witness to that farcical aspect of human bondage that Kolakowski adduced. Why then was Marxism like moral catnip? Not so much among the proposed beneficiaries, the working classes, who bore the brunt of its immiserating effects, but among the educated elite. Why? Well, beguiling simplicity was part of it. One of the causes of the popularity of Marxism among educated people, Kolakowski notes, was the fact that in its simple form, it was so very easy. Marxism, like Freudianism and Darwinianism and Hegelianism, is a one-key-fits-all lock philosophy. All aspects of human experience can be referred to the operation of a single governing process, which thereby offers the illusion of universal explanation. Marxism also spoke powerfully to mankind's unsatisfied utopian impulses. It is certainly true that free market societies are far from perfect. Think of how much conflict they abet, how many desires they leave unsatisfied. Can we not imagine a world beyond those tensions and conflicts in which we could realize our full human potential without competition, without scarcity, without want? A society in which, as Marx famously put it in the German ideology, the alienating division of labor has been overcome, and anyone can do one thing today and another tomorrow, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle at night, and be a critic after dinner, just as I have a mind. Well, yes, of course, we can imagine that, but there is a reason that the etymology of utopia, utopos, means no place. Kolakowski shows how Marx speaks powerfully to those unrealized and unrealizable utopian dreams. Marxism, he wrote, was the greatest fantasy of the 20th century, not because it offered a better life, but because it appealed to the apparently ineradicable spiritual cravings of mankind. The influence of that Marxism has achieved, he wrote, far from being the result or proof of its scientific character, is almost entirely due to its prophetic, fantastic, and irrational elements. Marxism is a doctrine of blind confidence that a paradise of universal satisfaction is awaiting us just around the corner. Almost all the prophecies of Marx and his followers have already been proved false, but this does not disturb the spiritual certainty of the faithful, any more than it did in the case of chiliastic sex. I believe that the world was supposed to come to an end last week, wasn't it? And when it didn't, whoever was propounding that idea said, well, in October, it will happen in October. In this sense, Marxism performs the function of a religion, and its efficacy is of a religious character. But Kolakowski notes, it's a caricature and a bogus form of religion, since it presents its temporal eschatology as a scientific system which religious mythologies do not purport to be. Of course, it is not just to mankind's spiritual cravings that Marxism appeals. It also speaks to its inherent thuggishness. This point cannot be emphasized too much. These days, outside of Russia anyway, Stalin and Stalinism are in bad odor. But we forget the romance that Western intellectuals indulged for this mass murderer. We also tend to overlook the fact that thuggishness is an integral, not an accidental feature of Marxism. Marx spoke of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, what was that? Well, Lenin gives us a clue. Dictatorship, he wrote in 1906, means unlimited power based on force, not law. In case that's not sufficiently compelling, Lenin added the word scientific, The scientific term dictatorship, he explained, means nothing more nor less than authority untrammeled by any laws, absolutely unrestricted by any rules whatever, and based directly on violence. I'm glad that Arthur Herman the other night reminded us that the romance about Lenin, the supposedly good commie, was completely false. In 1917, 100 years ago this month, Lenin finally got the chance to show the world what this theory would look like when put into action. He created a system, Kolakowski observed, in which, depending on the whim of a local party or police authority, any criticism might be regarded as counter-revolutionary and expose its author to imprisonment or death. Hence the importance of terror, an essential ingredient in the revolutionaries' utopian program, at least since Robespierre spoke of virtue and its emanation, terror. The courts, Lenin wrote in 1922, must not ban terror, but must formulate the motives underlying it, legalize it as a principle plainly, without any make-believe. The crucial thing to bear in mind here, however, is not the brutality of communist rule, what we might call really existing communism, but its spuriousness and contempt for law. This is what distinguishes ordinary despotism from its totalitarian counterpart. A law, Kolakowski notes, may provide draconian penalties for small offenses without being specifically totalitarian. What is characteristic of totalitarian law is the use of such formulas as Lenin's. People may be executed for expressing views that may objectively serve the interests of the bourgeoisie. This means that the government can put to death anyone it chooses. There is no such thing as law. It's not that the criminal code is severe, but that it has no existence except in name. In other words, the very arbitrariness of communist rule is a coefficient of its ambition to take total control of life. Lenin said that what socialism implies above all is keeping account of everything. Everything was subject to regulation from above because nothing had significance apart from the diktats of the party. In this sense, Marxism is a solution in which the idea of intrinsic value dissolves into absolute expediency. For the communist, there is no such thing as impartiality or disinterestedness because there is no such thing as an independent object of value. Nothing has inherent significance because everything acquires value from its function in the impersonal engine of utopia. Stalin once remarked that the death of an individual was a tragedy, but the death of a million was only a statistic. What he neglected to add is that for the communist, there is no such thing as an individual. By the same token, there is no such thing as independent judgment, scholarly, judicial, even aesthetic judgment. Our postmodernist literary critics are fond of declaring that there is no such thing as, you take your pick, intrinsic value, objectivity, race, sex, disinterestedness, impartiality, even truth. All is said to be socially constructed. None of the traditional values survive in the universal solvent of this malevolent frivolousness. Now, every candid observer knows that this frivolousness has landed its partisans in the cloud cuckoo land of self-contradictory nihilism. But Marx and Lenin got there before the lit-crit shtick. For the Marxist, art and literature are not human pursuits guided by their own rules of achievement. On the contrary, they are instruments to be used for the shifting and arbitrary ends of the party. Down with nonpartisan writers, Lenin wrote in 1905. Down with literary supermen. Literature, he said, must become part of the common cause of the proletariat, a cog and a screw in one single great social democratic mechanism set in motion by the entire politically conscious vanguard of the entire working class. What a disaster. The key issue is not partisan politics, but rather the subordinating of intellectual life generally to non-intellectual, that is to say, political imperatives. The greatest danger, Kolakowski wrote in an essay on the university, is the invasion of an intellectual fashion which wants to abolish cognitive criteria of knowledge and truth. The humanities and social sciences have always succumbed to various fashions, and this seems inevitable. But this is probably the first time that we are dealing with a fashion, or rather fashions, according to which there are no generally valid intellectual criteria. Indeed, it is this failure, the colonization of intellectual life by politics, that stands behind and fuels the degradation of liberal education. The issue is not so much, or not only, the presence of bad politics. Rather, the issue is the absence of non-politics in intellectual life of the university. As I mentioned, Sidney Hook described main currents of Marxism as magisterial. In its nimble mastery of intellectual history and generous humanity, the book has few equals. Kolakowski's survey of Marxist thought is breathtaking in its sweep from the Bible and the Greeks through the web of 19th century socialist thought and the florid dissemination of Marxist and quasi-Marxist ideas in the New Age readouts of the 20th century. Kolakowski has provided the definitive account of a spiritual political itinerary gone terribly wrong. But perhaps the most impressive thing about main currents of Marxism is not Kolakowski's breadth or learning, but his economy. This is a book from which the reader benefits from the author's great powers of distillation. It's a long book, 1,500 pages. In the hands of most writers, however, it would have been much longer. Kolakowski has an uncanny ability to seize upon and express the essential features of the doctrines he discusses. No doubt, this is partly a matter of talent, but it is also a testament to the huge labor, not only of reading, but also of sifting and synthesizing that went into the book. Kolakowski gives us not his first thoughts, but his considered judgments, honed of the superfluous. Anyone who reads these sobering volumes will come away with not only an understanding of the intellectual and spiritual precursors of Marxism, but also a good grasp of the essentials of classical Marxist doctrine and its hybridization in the Soviet Union, the Frankfurt School, and other left-wing impulses. Writing about the amorphous New Left of the 1960s, for example, Kolakowski notes that although ideological fantasies of this movement were no more than a nonsensical expression of the whims of spoiled middle-class children, and while the extremists among them were virtually indistinguishable from fascist thugs, the movement did without doubt express a profound crisis of faith in the values that had inspired democratic societies for many decades. The New Left explosion of academic youth was an aggressive movement born of frustration, which easily created a vocabulary for itself out of Marxist slogans: liberation, revolution, alienation, now we have resistance. Apart from this, its ideology really has little in common with Marxism. It consists of revolution without the working class, hatred of modern technology as such, the cult of primitive societies as a source of progress, hatred of education and specialized knowledge. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Now, to be an anatomist of totalitarianism is also to be a connoisseur of freedom, its many beguiling counterfeits as well as its genuine aspirations. The question, the lure, the never fulfilled but inescapable promise of freedom stands at the center of much of Kolakowski's work. In an essay called The Self-Poisoning of the Open Society, Kolakowski dilates on an antinomy of liberalism that beset Western societies during the Cold War and is, if anything, even more pressing today as we negotiate with what amounts to a moral war with fundamentalist Islam and the advent of the new left of Antifa and kindred movements. The antinomy is this. Liberalism implies openness to other points of view, even, it would seem, to those points of view whose success would destroy liberalism. Tolerance to those points of view is a prescription for suicide. Intolerance betrays the fundamental premise of liberalism, namely openness. Kolakowski is surely right that our liberal, pluralist democracy depends for its survival not only on the continued existence of its institution, but also on a belief in their value and widespread will to defend them. Do we, as a society, enjoy that belief? Do we possess the requisite will? I think the jury is still out on those questions. A good test is the extent to which we can resolve that antinomy of liberalism. And a good start on that problem is the extent to which we realize that the antinomy is, in the business of everyday life, illusory. The openness that liberal society rightly cherishes is not a vacuous openness to all points of view. It is not value neutral. It need not, indeed it cannot say yes to all comers. American democracy, for example, affords its citizens great latitude. But great latitude is not synonymous with the proposition that anything goes. Our society, like every society, is founded on particular positive values. The rule of law, for example, respect for the individual, religious freedom, the separation of church and state, and so on. Western democratic society, that is to say, is rooted in what Kolakowski calls a particular vision of the world. Part of that vision is a commitment to openness, but openness is not the same thing as indifference. For centuries, political philosophers have understood that the unbridled lust for equality is the enemy of freedom. That lust underwrote the tragedy of communist tyranny. The rise of political correctness has redistributed that lust over a new roster of issues. Not the proletariat, but the environment. Not the struggling masses, but so-called reproductive freedom, gay rights, the third world, diversity training, and an end to racism and xenophobia, which are held to be ubiquitous. It looks, in Marx's famous mot, like history repeating itself as farce. It would be a rash man, however, who made no provision for a reprise of tragedy. Thank you.